Welcome to this episode of Teaching Unpacked, and this is episode, help me out, 4 or 5? Because last time I was wrong. I think we're 5. 6?
5 or 6.
5 or 6. Anyway.
Episode 5.
5. And today we are with the fabulous Maura Hart. But before we start talking with Maura, I want to take just a minute to thank once again Peter and Molly Eppig for their generosity and their support of this project. Without them, well, without Peter, there would be no Critical Skills Classroom, and without their support, there would be no Teaching Unpacked. So thank you, Peter and Molly. I also want to thank Harold Hale, who is behind the scenes here answering any technical questions that people have, as well as Peg Smeltz and Shelley Viles, who have taken care of all of the publicity and the registration, and who take care of all the questions that typically come in after we're done about how do I get a certificate, or where do I find the link to the next webcast. So thanks to them as well. So next thing up is to introduce ourselves. Tom, you want to go first?
Tom Julius, faculty member at Antioch University, New England in the education department. Been part of Antioch for 22 years, and prior to that taught early elementary, kindergarten, 2nd, 3rd grade in public schools in New England.
Awesome. And I am Laura Thomas, as I already said. This is I think I'm starting my 20th year at Antioch, which is sort of crazy to think about. And I am now the director of the Experienced Educators Program, and spent about 10 years before I came to Antioch teaching high school speech, theater, English, and debate in high schools. And now, alongside being at Antioch, I'm also a 1-day-a-week librarian in a K-6 school out in Harrisville, which is about 20 minutes from here. So they keep me honest, those K-6 kiddos. You don't get anything past them. So a couple of housekeeping details real quickly. I see some familiar faces in the list, so I know some of you already know this. As I already said, the webinar is being recorded, including the chat and the question and answer transcripts, and everything is available at youtube.com CriticalSkills1. Also on the Teaching Unpacked webpage, which is available on the resources page. I'll drop that URL in the chat at the end of our time together. But it's always the same, tinyurl.com/aune-web- whichever number webinar it is. So we're on 5 now. If you have questions, those should go in the Q&A on Zoom here, and use the chat at least to begin with for technical issues only. Once we get a little farther in, I think Maura is going to have you answer some questions in the chat, and that's awesome. But just at the beginning here, let's keep that open for people who are having technical problems. And as always, Antioch retains the intellectual property rights to all of this. We're happy to share, so reach out and ask if you want something. We won't be sharing these slides, but we will have a resources document that'll have links to everything that Maura references. And so without further ado, Tom, do you want to introduce our guest today?
So Maura, I'll get to your professional background in a minute, but I have to say, and I know this is too much for everybody to read all of the wonderful things that there are about you here, but I do want to focus on down there on the 4th from the bottom line. You live on a small farm, and I remember visiting your house many years ago. And what I remember is a hillside of, I think it was goats. Yeah. Was it goats back then? And so what are the animals, what do you have on the farm these days?
So actually we're down now to just 5 sheep, a couple of dogs, a couple of cats, but we had been 7 sheep, but 2 of them were male, and we don't want any more sheep. But prior to that, we had horses, goats, llamas, sheep, chickens, ducks, and mostly it was because we just like animals, but none of my children like kind of stepped up to the plate on any of the caretaking. So kind of one by one, the animals went their merry way, and every once in a while, apart from the horses, my husband and I would be like, yes, another one bites the dust. So now we're down to just sheep, although the horses were a great and terrible loss,
All right.
but they lived a nice long life.
Well, it's so lovely to think about your sort of hillside farm there, and the time I spent. Now, Maura taught middle and high school language arts and English, and went on to get her doctoral degree. But before that, Maura, correct me if I'm wrong. Were you in? Maura has an actual master's degree in critical skills. So she's got the credentials that tell us that she's an expert. Maura, was that the first critical skills cohort?
Yes, it was. Yeah.
Yeah. So, and she's been practicing critical skills ever since, has and still leads critical skills immersive institutes. Especially, Maura has been our go-to instructor for the Level 2 Institute many times over many years. In that Level 2, teachers come back after having participated in a Level 1 institute, use the model in their classrooms, and now want to refine the way they work with students. So now most of Maura's work is in schools, helping teams of teachers and administrators work together effectively to promote equity and make more great learning happen. Right? And so, Maura, thank you so much for being here, and welcome to Teaching Unpacked.
Thank you. It's fun. I've been looking forward to it, especially after watching my colleagues all deliver their perspective on the critical skills classroom. So I'm really happy to be here with a little bit of a different perspective. Today I'm going to talk about where the components of the critical skills classroom and the components of distributed leadership kind of merge. So we're kind of toggling between the classroom and the school in terms of site-based leadership, if you will. Before I begin, however, I want to start with a little bit of prior knowledge, and I want to learn, who's out there in terms of what you know. So the three big ideas of today's talk will be the critical skills classroom practices that are proven to be effective through 40 years of research or evidence-based practices, and the practices of distributed leadership. So if you would take a minute or maybe a minute and a half, I'll pause. I'd like you to write anything you already know about any of those three topics in the chat box, not in the Q&A, in the chat box. So what do you know about the critical skills classroom? What do you know about practices that are proven to be effective or evidence-based? What do you know about distributed leadership? I'm going to be quiet for about a minute, and Laura and Tom, I'll let you kind of talk about what you see in the chat box.
Okay.
And I'll chime in if I can't help it. Because I don't think I can see the chat box, right?
I don't know. If you go down to the bottom with the little,
Yeah.
no.
There might not be a chat box. Oh, I found it.
No.
All right.
Well, Tom said that in critical skills, people work in collaborative teams, and Celeste added, the critical skills should be intentionally identified for students.
Yep. Excellent.
And I would add that the distributed leadership piece, you know, those first two, I see a lot together, obviously. But the third one is an unusual addition, at least in my experience.
All right. There's one more chat. I'm so glad I found the chat box.
Yeah, Celeste added distributed leadership takes time and commitment.
Yeah, thank you, Celeste. A lot like developing a critical skills classroom, in fact. Okay, I'm going to move along. I want to introduce sort of our agenda and what I hope folks who are out there listening will get as a result of our time together. So we're kind of in the middle of orienting to the webcast content. So that's the big picture, the three key ideas that we're going to talk about and explore today. Then I'm going to go more deeply into the comparison of classroom practices with evidence-based practice. And I'm going to cite two researchers in particular, John Hattie and Robert Marzano. Following that, I'm going to move right into the practices of distributed leadership, and we'll kind of toggle back and forth between what's the same between distributed leadership in the critical skills classroom. And then finally, and last but not least, we're going to talk about facilitation of both, because that's the kind of the crux of this work. In terms of what I hope you guys will get out of this in your time spent here is that you'll begin with prior knowledge. You'll identify your own prior knowledge so that you can connect better to the things that I talk about and that we share as an experience here on this webcast. That you'll be able to analyze critical skills classroom practices and compare them with what we know works, evidence-based. I'm hoping that by the time we're done today, you can describe what we mean by distributed leadership, and ultimately that you can synthesize this. You can synthesize the critical skills classroom and distributed leadership to see how they merge in terms of, it is the same work with human beings who are learners trying to solve problems together. And as always, we'll do our best to transfer learning, reflect, and create some closure. So that's the agenda and the learner outcomes. And this is my cat, Cleo, who wanted to take part. So Tom described my work as a critical skills classroom teacher in the middle school and in high schools in New Hampshire and in Vermont. And then I moved away from that when I got my degrees and had children. And what I discovered impassioned me about my work in the critical skills classroom, teaching kids and leading teams of teachers to make decisions and lead a school, is that when this quote, when people are committed together and they share a common purpose and they can experience a passion around that, they really can do anything. I've seen it happen with kids in my critical skills classroom, and I've seen it happen with schools, with teams of teachers and administrators who are trying to collectively create a continuous cycle of improvement. So, and actually putting this together and looking at that quote, I realized that that's why I do what I do, because people are the same whether we're adults or whether we're children, and we just need the correct construct set up so that we can do our best work and find our value collectively. So I'm going to move right into the critical skills classroom. This will be a brief review for those of you who are critical skills classroom teachers, and it will be a brief introduction for those of you who have not heard of the critical skills classroom. I'm really narrowing it down here, taking, great big fat book and a whole bunch of tools into one slide. The key point about the critical skills classroom is that students experience it rather than have education delivered to them. They create it. They create their learning by experiencing the learning. That they work collaboratively, and I want to talk about the difference between collaborative and cooperative. Collaborative is when the individuals on a team actually have a passion, a commitment to the outcome. As opposed to cooperative is, okay, we can work together, but it's kind of missing that passion and that commitment to an outcome and an understanding of an individual role within that team. So the critical skills classroom fosters that kind of collaboration, that kind of commitment, that kind of understanding of what I can present to my team, and that passion to the work that we do together. The critical skills classroom is driven by competencies, outcomes, standards, and it's problem-based. In other words, we want to take our curriculum and turn it into a problem for students to solve in order for them to get to the competency that we want them to get to, or to achieve the learner outcome that we as teachers want them to get. The characteristics really just kind of describe what you would see in a critical skills classroom, and I'm not going to read or talk about all of that. I'll just give you a minute, or actually about 20 seconds, to look at that, and in particular pull out the bold and start thinking about what you know of distributed leadership while you look at what goes on, what a critical skills classroom, what it's characterized by in terms of what students are doing. Okay, I'm going to move on. There you go. That was your introduction, your review, and that's it. That's all you get. No, not really. We're going to talk about it through the whole thing. Okay. Now I'm going to talk about distributed leadership. There are two really key things that you want to pay attention to when you're facilitating distributed leadership or implementing distributed leadership in your school. One is teaming, and the other is communication. So in terms of teaming, there are certain things you've got to pay attention to in order for it to be effective. Roles, structures, procedures, that's so that people can come together and solve problems together without reinventing the wheel every time they come together. They know what time they meet, they know how they meet, they have an agenda that's set. Sorry about my cat. A really key piece of distributed leadership is that we need the voices of all of our people on our distributed leadership team, because we need the perspective of a varied set of roles in a school. And so we need voices, but we're in a school and we have a whole lot more to do than actually really we have time to do it. So you want to make sure that you're balancing time and voice, and it's happening all the time. There is always that push to make sure that we've got equity of voice so that we can get all of the perspectives to shine on what we're trying to do, and that we are moving along and solving problems and getting things done and finding solutions in a continuous cycle of improvement. More than anything else, you want to make sure that people understand the what and how and why of what they're doing, and you want to take time to help them understand how they're making a decision and write it down. One of the key problems that happens when you start to create distributed leadership is folks don't know, well, what decisions are our purview, what decisions are the purview of the administration, what decisions are the purview of the district. So you want to really articulate that when you set up your team. And then in communication, a distributed leadership team is nothing if it's not communicating out to all of the stakeholders that play a part in the work that they're doing. So that communication piece is mostly outward. The inward communication piece falls within teaming under roles, structures, and procedures. Make sure that you've set up healthy and effective ways to communicate internally, and then also externally, because you're always trying to align your systems, policies, and procedures. You want to gain as much perspective as you can. You know, as a school, we're beholden to all of our stakeholders, and we're trying to collectively make things better for everyone. So we've got to gather input. Communication, no matter where you go, you want multiple approaches and repetition, feedback loops, and you're constantly trying to achieve common understanding. I also want to talk a little bit about adaptive versus technical leadership. And this comes from the National Implementation Research Network, or NERN. It's the implementation science. There are two kinds of problems that we tend to face in life. One is technical, where there are really clear solutions to that problem, and it just kind of needs a hierarchy of people to make it happen. More often in schools, and this relates to schools and the critical skills classroom, the problems are more adaptive, meaning there isn't really one solution, there's a multitude of solutions. And there isn't one perspective, there's a multitude of perspectives. And you've got to combine those solutions and those perspectives to try to get to the best one. And it's not necessarily linear. So distributed leadership uses adaptive leadership so that we can get at the meat of wiggly problems, which is what we experience in education most of the time. And similarly, that's what you're doing in the critical skills classroom as well. You're helping kids to harness adaptive leadership to find solutions to problems they encounter as they move through their experiential cycle. This is where I would normally stop and say questions and provide a good deal of wait time and make eye contact with my folks, but I can't, so I'm going to move along, which is just as well, because, you know, we are always under time constraints. Okay, so again, I'm not going to read this slide to you, but I am going to point out that I started out in the beginning that the 4 broad ideas of the critical skills classroom are that it's experiential, collaborative, problem-based, and outcome-driven learning. Well, that's the same thing with distributed leadership. They are the same components. You need collaboration. Your team is going to experience problems and go through experiences to solve them. They are problem-based, and we're always looking at student outcomes. That's what drives the work of a distributed leadership process. But it will be school-wide at this point, or team-wide. So on the left, you'll see some components of distributed leadership. And on the right, you'll see skills taught in the critical skills classroom. And I'm going to pause and give you a moment to kind of acclimate to this slide and think about how the two begin to merge. The things that are taught in the skills that are taught in the critical skills classroom are technically what's necessary to operate an effective distributed leadership continuous cycle of improvement. Okay, I'm going to move into evidence-based practices. When I talk about evidence-based practices, what I'm referring to is 40+ years of empirical research, 40+ years of research that's been done on what works in schools. And with this, in particular, we're looking at classroom practices. And this research is, it has been peer-reviewed, it's valid. Hold on, there. And I'm going to highlight 2 folks who have looked at thousands of studies and kind of narrowed them down. So John Hattie looked at over 1,200 studies, and he kind of created a scale of effectiveness. He looked at what works most in terms of a classroom practice, and anything above a 40% on his scale is going to be effective. Anything less than a 40% is just the result of, you know, a kid has sat in a classroom for a year. And Robert Marzano and his team looked at all this research and divided it into 3 categories: feedback, content, and context. So if you think about collaborative problem-based learning and evidence-based practice, what I really, really, really want to stress here is that everything we do as educators to build and create a classroom that is critical skills for our students uses a multitude of practices that have been proven to work. And I've listed a few here. And I also want to point out that there are a series of these slides on the resources page that have a whole lot more information in them. I had to pare them down. So in this one, I pared down an awful lot. John Hattie's findings are things that we see in the critical skills classroom, and they're things that we see in terms of distributed leadership. So the next kind of stair I want to go up is, again, human beings are the same whether we're children or whether we're adults. And we're always learning. So when you think about collective teacher efficacy, for example, that's the first one on the top left, that is the understanding within a school building collective that all of the teachers recognize that they are effective at what they do and that they can learn and grow and continue to get better. And you see that in the critical skills classroom as well with kids, recognizing their own strengths and abilities. So a story I want to tell is about a class that I taught in middle school, who a lot of the folks around me didn't think these kids could do what they did. They were really effective at problem solving and at communication. And so I asked them if they wanted to take it out, if they wanted to find a business that they could teach. And they said, absolutely. They took it on. So they contacted all these businesses, local businesses, and found one who said, yeah, sure, come on. And they did a workshop for team leads to have the team leads work effectively around communication and problem solving for the groups of people that they led. And these kids showed up to school. They set their own quality criteria around how they would dress and how they would communicate with these outside agencies. And they did it to the point where they did a debrief at the end of their mini lesson out in the business that they met with. And people were astounded and learned something new. Those kids, you couldn't stop them after that. And that's collective student efficacy, and collective teacher efficacy relates to distributed leadership in the same way. So a similar story, I'm working with some schools in Oklahoma, and they have an AWARE grant, which is a grant that aligns schools with outside agencies and highlights social emotional learning for kids within the school and within the classroom. And I met with a group of teachers who had just started a distributed leadership team, because I told them that's what they had to do last year. And they were absolutely despondent, and they didn't feel like they had any kind of control or power. And slowly but surely, they created their team, they set up roles and structures and practices. And do you know, by the end of this year, they just turned in their kind of, this is what we did. They documented their work, which is really important. They implemented and are sustaining with fidelity 3 new curriculum pieces around social emotional learning and a really well-structured communication feedback loop. And those teachers, they, especially after this spring, they're all on email with me, and they want to set up a meeting to get ready for next year. Now, how many people want to get on this on the web right now? Really? Well, except all you guys who are here. So I'm trying to illustrate that we're talking about the same stuff. When we run a critical skills classroom, we're also working with distributed leadership practices. And then Robert Marzano, he chunked his evidence-based practice work into feedback, content, and context. These are things that you'll see in a distributed leadership team as well as a critical skills classroom. So these are some pictures that I chose to show you, because obviously these are all adults, and they look exactly like my kids used to look when I taught in the critical skills classroom. Right down to, like, if you look at these faces in the top left, I wouldn't say they're necessarily agreeing with each other, but they are communicating effectively. And I just pulled out the one on the top right, because an effective and evidence-based classroom practice is to have your students chunk their content. And if there was anything that my kids did in the critical skills classroom, was chunk the problem and figure out how they were going to tackle it. And so the top right picture is where a team came together, set up the constructs of their team to do meaningful work for the school, and then they brainstormed everything that was on their plate that they had to do, and that's that list. And then they had, you know, a moment of insecurity and went, oh my God, we have so much to do. And I said, let's chunk it out. And they chunked it out. And they came up with, it looks like 3 categories there to me. You know, black circle, green square, and pink triangle. And then they prioritized what was under that, and they ended up with 3 priorities that they took for the year and added more as they moved along. The last thing I want to talk about is, the cornerstone of a critical skills classroom is really clear, effective facilitation or coaching as a teacher. And that's the cornerstone of distributed leadership. And we've talked a lot about, balance of voice and time. I haven't talked a lot about establishing safety, but it's really important that you establish a safe learning environment for your students and your teachers. Shared understanding, problem solving. So in terms of facilitation, these are the things that you want in the forefront of your mind as a classroom teacher and as a facilitator of distributed leadership. So I've got 2 ways for you to now begin to talk and think. I want you to think about what's something you'll take back to your area of work. And you don't have to write in the chat box. You can just kind of bring this up in your reflection in our discussion that will happen now in terms of things that were resonant for you. So what will you transfer and what's resonant for you? And that's what I got for you.
Thanks, Maura. Wow, the Q&A is already starting. So do you want to go right into the first question, Tom, or do you want to chat a little bit first?
Let's just frame this with the critical skills model for a minute. Actually, Maura, why don't you keep your slides open there?
Oh, did I close them?
Because I think there'll probably be a few. Why don't you go back to the slide that has the photographs?
Okay.
For now, I think there are a couple other slides we might want to talk about. Oh, I know. So there's this slide, and then if you go a little further on, there's the experiential learning cycle slide. Could you take us to that one?
Forward or back?
Forward.
Forward. It's towards the end. Yeah. Keep going.
It's in one of the ones at the bottom.
Yeah.
Keep going.
There you go. So, Maura, you did a really nice job of summarizing the critical skills model. And well, part of that, you said it's collaborative, it's outcomes based, and it's experiential. And it sounds to me like what you're saying is that in the same way that we design experiences in classrooms, and the teacher goes through these phases of the cycle, and the students go through these phases of the cycle, that you're saying that teaching teams, that we have the principal or whoever, or the school head being the teacher in this case, designs an experience, coaches, gives feedback, and that the teachers and the staff are getting engaged, that they're exhibiting their learning in some way, they're debriefing, and then moving on to the next challenge.
Mm-hmm.
Is that what we're saying?
Yeah, it's entirely accurate. And then I'll go back and talk more discreetly about those pieces as related to distributed leadership. Before that, though, I want to talk about the connected snails that those of you who are, critical skills groupies know what I mean. But the connected snails are that, you don't teach any skill or knowledge standard in isolation, that the students are constantly learning and growing based on what they've learned before and where they're headed. And that's the same thing when you're immersed in a continuous cycle of improvement as a school. So, and yeah, you talked about the principal. There are 2 ways of looking at distributed leadership. You can look at it as an entire school where the principal is the teacher or coach. And you can also look at it in terms of a leadership team where anyone can take on being the facilitator. But it's the same no matter which one of those two approaches you take. The critical skills and dispositions are the skills that teachers take into solving problems together. So they've got to be able to listen to each other. They've got to be able to make decisions. They've got to be able to communicate. They've got to be able to organize, similar, just like kids. And at the principal or the facilitator is constantly fostering those skills. Even as adults, we don't have that down at all. We have to keep practicing and design feedback loops to continue to learn and grow. The knowledge and understanding piece is, what better people to solve problems in a school building than the teachers who are experiencing them firsthand? So, I'm a technical assistance provider, so I come in and I'll do professional development, and part of me feels apologetic because I haven't been in the classroom for over 10 years. So the real experts are the classroom teachers. They know what their kids are experiencing. They know their students. They know their curriculum. They know their community, their school, their parents. So you want that knowledge and understanding to come into helping solve problems within a continuous cycle of improvement. And then moving into the cycle, you'll engage as a team. You'll look at data. You look at student data and school data and figure out, you really have to understand the problem, just like kids do, before you can try solutions and exhibit them. So try solutions, maybe, set up a pilot in a classroom, and then you reflect on that and you get feedback on that. And you debrief that and you continue right into, did it work? Didn't it work? What are we going to do next? Connected snails.
Yeah.
And this is a snail. Actually, I think if you advance just a little bit, Maura, another slide or two, keep going. There's a cut. That's what people talk about. There you go. When people talk about snails, they talk about these a series of these experiential learning cycles that look like a snail.
Yeah. Yeah. And one of the things that I think that's really interesting, you asked the question about takeaways. I've worked with people in the past with different, like with our colleagues in the UK and, the single steps learning people in the UK and Scotland, and with you and other folks who've talked about using critical skills as a leadership strategy. And I could sort of see it, but not really. But there's something that I think, as we've been talking about this idea of problem-based leadership, that, when we talk about problem-based challenges and we have that little XY axis with the arrow, and we talk about how over time things get messier and more authentic and more real world. Well, the problems that teachers and school teams are solving are the messiest, most real world challenges. So they're way up at the top of that ray that comes out of the XY axis. And so to me, it really resonates that, like, if you go back to that slide that shows the 9 characteristics, I think it was just 2 back from here. When you take those 9 characteristics, and if you just make all of those teachers, or that all of those are the characteristics of a really solid distributed leadership team or an organization that is working from that perspective, all of that makes sense all of a sudden. Mm-hmm. And that really gives you a clear sense of what it is that you're shooting for as a leader, is to create an environment where these are the things that happen just as part of the way we operate together. They're just in our culture.
Mm-hmm. And I can imagine, Laura, Maura gave us that example on the slide with all the photographs and the chart where they had to they had this long list of things that there was challenging them, and then it seems like their first problem-based challenge was, what do we do with this? How do we set some priorities for ourselves? What do we focus on? Yeah. That was kind of, in a sense, that was their first problem-based challenge in that series. And then once they've prioritized, and Maura, you said they pinpointed, specific things in each of these areas and then prioritized them. Well, that takes you to your next problem-based learning challenge and your next cycle. Okay, now how do we get engaged with this? You know, what's the coaching we need? How do we exhibit our learning? What do we learn from it? And again, that takes you on. So it's almost like the work that we do as a teaching team in a school is that series of problem-based, it is like a series of problem-based challenges.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
And this, when you think also about the collaborative learning community and how, you know, we know that in a classroom, kids are able to manage and work successfully with increasingly messy problems to solve, sort of in correlation with the quality of the community that they're working in. And when I transfer that to an adult setting, teachers who feel safe and respected, and all the stuff that you had on one of those earlier slides with the research, teachers who identify that that's the kind of school they're in, who have a high degree of efficacy, not just as educators, but as community members, as professionals in a professional environment, are going to be able to handle these kinds of problems more, I think, more effectively, more successfully, because they have a greater sense of agency.
Mm-hmm.
So then when I translate that into March, when we got this huge, authentic, brand new problem to solve, which is, hey, by the way,
we're going to remote learning.
Yeah, school's online for maybe 2 weeks or maybe a month, or we don't know. And we don't know how, but we're going to give you an extra long weekend to figure it out. Like, if you were in a really solid learning community, I think that impossible task would feel a little bit more manageable. And I think for teachers who might feel isolated or less supported, that could have been, it could have popped them right out of that zone of proximal development into that danger zone where they're just like, I don't know. And so I think, I'm seeing all these correlations that I didn't before, all these connections.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that safety piece is really important. We assume several things about adult learning. One is that they feel safe and confident all the time. And the other is that they are skilled communicators, skilled decision makers, skilled problem solvers. And really, none of us really ever always feel that way. And so principals of schools need to do everything they can to create a really safe place for teachers to gain agency and ownership and direct the school.
Which takes moving through those same stair steps that students have to move through in terms of getting from knowledge to communication to collaboration, and that at each step you're building trust.
Yeah.
So on that safety question, Bill actually asked if you could address the distinction between safe and unsafe.
So, well, you mentioned the zone of proximal development, Laura.
Sorry, I misread. Address the distinction between challenging and unsafe.
Okay, I'm still going to go to the zone of proximal development. We need to create environments and relationships that are safe enough so that we can take on challenges, so that we can put ourselves, in a kind of unsteady place where we're not quite sure, but we're safe enough to go there. Instead of, if it's not a safe place, we're not even going to go there. We're not even going to push ourselves to step out of our comfort zone and try to find a different solution, or step out of our comfort zone and challenge someone on our team that we don't agree with. You've got to create, as a facilitator of a distributed leadership or a coach of a critical skills classroom, a safe enough environment for people to allow themselves to move toward challenge. I hope that answered your question, Bill.
So that relates closely to a question that was formulating in my mind. So let's say I'm a principal of a school where the teachers don't have knowledge of the critical skills model, and I, as a principal, I believe in all the things you've been talking about. Do I need my teachers' buy-in in some way? Or do I just what do I do? I just start? What do I do first? That was 3 questions. Sorry.
One of the things I mentioned to the team that I worked with out in Oklahoma, and one of the first things I said to them was, you need to go slow to go fast. And without teacher buy-in, without teacher understanding, it's never really ever going to get off the ground, which brings me to the slow part. You have to set up constructs wherein people feel safe enough to solve problems together in order for them to buy in. And I mean, I feel like, it's the revolving door of initiatives in schools where teachers just don't take on what, the principal said they have to do. And in part, it's because they don't have ownership. They don't have agency. They haven't been asked their opinion, and their opinion is exceptionally valuable because they have the experience of teaching kids in their classroom. They're the experts.
So when you talk about the need for safety, I think this slide and this chart that you've got up there with the symbols is it may be a good example. So it may be that in my school, I'm the principal, and in my school, my teachers feel overwhelmed. They keep coming to me and say, I just got too much on my plate. So as the principal, in order to make them feel safe, help create safety, and to get them to buy in, I might say, well, an early thing for us to do as a team is we need to prioritize. We need to name the things that are problems, and then we need to get some priorities. So that chart, I think, is a really good example of something that a principal, kind of low level, that a principal could do first. And then it seems to me that the safety part that you're talking about is where the principal doesn't leave them out to dry.
Right.
If my teachers say, these are the 3 priorities, then basically as a principal, I've got my marching orders. Do I have to attend to the school board? Of course. Do I have to listen to my superintendent? Absolutely. And the things that they're bringing to my plate. But if this is what my teachers are saying, then I have to really commit myself to supporting them in getting what they need in order to achieve these things. And it seems to me that that's part of the safety.
Yeah, really well said, Tom. And the piece around that people struggle with, administrators may struggle with, is that what they're doing is trusting that their teachers know what they need. And so, like, I worked with a high school who did a visioning process with all of their faculty. Everyone wrote down, what would our school look like if it were fantastic, if all kids were learning, if people were happy to come through the door, everybody, what would it look like? And we facilitated them to write all these things down and then prioritize those. And then the principal said, okay, what do you want to work on first? We can take on 2 to 3 things a year. And it may be that we take on the same things for several years in a row. And this was a group of high school teachers, which are often difficult to work with just because of the structure of schools. They don't have that safety net of being able to talk through things together. So there's a lack of common understanding. So it's difficult not to work with them, but to get them to move forward in a continuous cycle of improvement. This principal had them come up with their top 3. They designed a leadership team to kind of facilitate the problem-solving process throughout the year. And the teachers took on their top 3. One of them was rigor. And they realized the first thing they had to do was identify and come to a common understanding of what did they mean by rigor. And that year, those teachers had the most fantastic conversations about what was going on in their classrooms and practices that they were using that got kids to what they thought of as a rigorous level. So that's teacher ownership. And then they said, okay, let's bring some people in to teach us the way that we can teach in our classroom. So rather than an administrator saying, you're going to do this and you're going to like it, they had the faculty saying, can we get someone to come in and teach us, the best way to use problem-based learning so that we can approach these competencies? Because we think that that's going to be rigorous. So it's flipped it right around.
You know, I think there's something really interesting in that particular story too around a lot of times there are surveys and there are what I like to call collaboration theater. So there are sort of the trappings of collaboration, but I know a lot, it's almost a joke in a lot of schools that, you know, there'll be an email that comes out asking people to name their priorities for professional development for the coming year, and everyone fills it out. And then the thing that shows up on their professional development calendar for the next year has nothing to do with even anything that was an item on the survey. And or they'll fill out a table, like, you know, they have this great picture of, you know, the sorting, but then the priorities that actually show up don't represent that. So I think there's this way too where leaders have to earn the trust of their teams by actually sticking with what they said they were going to do. Just like classroom teachers can't sort of set up these collaborative environments, but then when things get messy or hard or complicated, they just shut it all down and go back to a totally teacher-centered model, and then expect the kids to trust them again when they say, you know, oh no, we're going to do it this way now. Like, you know, what you do speaks louder than what you say. And I think that's an important part of this, is to recognize that just that facilitation piece is not always comfortable or easy, and but you're responsible for maintaining the trust of the people that you're there to serve, whether they be 5-year-olds or 50-year-olds. You're still, as the facilitator, you are there to serve their needs, not the other way around.
Oh, and we all know what it feels like to be, you know, how many times have we left the classroom like, I'm shutting it all down. I can't, I can't. How many administrators have left going, oh my God, what have I got myself into? But you're right, you've got to push through and yeah, be who you said you would be.
Yeah, and over time and with experience, you learn, you know, how to scaffold and how to support and how much people need you to do and how much they are ready to do for themselves. And so you don't throw people in on the deep end on the first day, because then they'll drown, but you also, you know, it's a gradual process of becoming. There's one final comment, and then I think we're ready for closing thoughts. Bill added in the chat, this sorting and labeling process illustrated was really valuable as we dealt with all of the issues associated with reopening school in the fall. What looked like a list of 25 to 30 different things to worry about turned out to be 4 big issues. This really helped create a sense of ownership and manageability and organized our problem-solving teams.
Yep.
Which I think is great, yeah, because that list there looks terrifying and overwhelming, but if you could get that down to 4 questions.
Yeah.
So Maura, you know, what you really provide with us today is, I think, a great example of what learning organizations do, right? Schools as learning organizations, and how we can enhance the sort of collective capacity of teachers and administrators to work as teams towards common goal and pursue common goals. And you really, you know, one of my takeaways, in addition to that, so thank you for giving us that model. And one of my big takeaways is how the critical skills is a model for lifelong learning. That all those critical skills that were identified as these are the things that students need in order to be effective in the job place. Back when the critical skills model was first being developed, well, guess what? Those are the skills we need in the workplace, including in schools, and that we need teachers and administrators to be practicing and developing their capacity to do effectively. So that's really helpful to remember.
Yeah.
So Maura, any closing thoughts?
Well, I don't know that they're closing, but I do want to point out a couple of things in these pictures. If you look at the bottom right picture, that woman in the pink with the black vest, she's not really happy. You know, she's just kind of sitting there like, okay, you're going to come save us? She's looking at me. You're going to come help us out here? And, there's frustration and there's confusion, and life doesn't really get any easier, whether you're a kid or whether you're a teacher in school. So the more you can learn how to harness the collective efficacy of people, the better off we'll all be. We just need everyone. We need the opinion and the perspective and the experience of as many people as we can in order to really harness and move forward in a collective and positive way. And schools need it more than ever now.
Very true. Well
Thank you, Maura.
said. Thank you, Maura. So I am dropping in the chat a link to the resources page, which has on it the link to the evaluation. If you need a certificate of participation, that you can get that at the end of the evaluation. We make it work for your certificate. If you have any trouble with that, just email me. You will also receive an email with this link. So if you don't get it from here, we'll reach out to you first. And if you have any trouble with it, just respond to that email, and we'll get you taken care of. That email that you'll receive will also have the link to the Teaching Unpacked homepage, where you can find information about our next webcast, which will feature Allison Robinson, who is a middle school social studies teacher, and she's going to be talking specifically about teacher as coach, about those facilitation moves, those coaching moves that we make, and how to make them work in even complicated, challenging classrooms. Because, yeah, sometimes we all have those days, right? So thank you, Maura, so much for being with us. I really appreciate it. I know Tom does as well.
It's been fun.
Oh, looks like there's a problem with the link. Don't worry, I will, you'll get it out by email as well. So if it doesn't work now, give me about 5 minutes and I'll get it fixed. Thank you very much.
Thanks, everyone. Be
Bye.
well.
Thank you.
Stay in touch. Thank you, Maura.
Bye-bye.